the freedom to exercise them. Indigenous property rights are the forgotten human right and were fundamental for the long-term sustainability of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Never again can Aboriginal people, constrained, demeaned and bullied by a failed state legal regime, be declared by a state premier that they have failed and that their communities must close. On the 4th of August of this year, the Western Australian Acting Commissioner for Children and Young People provided to the Parliament a report. That report's titled Listen to Us, using the views of WA Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and young people to improve policy and service delivery. It's a great report. Quoted early in the report was a 15-year-old Balladong Yuit Jupan Wodjak boy who stated what was important to him was, quote, having recognition for my culture and having our words heard by our government. I want the government to finally respect our culture and what they have done. 15. Similarly, a 15-year-old Yaru boy stated, and I quote, culture tells me who I am and makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I belong somewhere. And the report is replete with quotes from young kids. It's fantastic. The report went on to state that the loss of culture stems from the continuing impact of historical policies of dispossession and assimilation, as well as the marginalisation and intergenerational trauma experienced by Aboriginal people. It is in this context that the WA government has introduced its proposed amendments to the Aboriginal Heritage Act. Generally, all agreed that the current Aboriginal Heritage Act, a 1972 Act, as Sandra helpfully pointed out, went through the Parliament 2 years before I was born, was in dire need of reform. What has been produced by the WA government has had one rare positive impact. It has unified all Aboriginal people in opposition. All. At every level, the state government's amendments disempower Aboriginal people and devalue their heritage. Perhaps there is no starker example of a government that has yet to understand the value of our state heritage and the importance of that heritage to Aboriginal people. The Supreme Court, Chief Justice, has recently sent a thunderbolt through the Department for Aboriginal Affairs that will, in due course, I am convinced, aid it on its way to its eventual departmental demise. In the case of Robinson and Fielding, Justice Chaney comprehensively exposed the disingenuous nature of both the Minister, I think, and his departmental leadership on heritage. Determined to undermine the value of heritage, it was the department that insisted that the Marapikarinya Yintha, a body of water that includes the harbour in Port Hedland, as well as the mangrove flats and creeks that feed into the harbour, be deregistered as a site. It had been registered in 2008. This deregistration was against the express wish of the proponent, the Port Hedland Authority. I want to emphasise that. The Port Hedland Port Authority pleaded with the government not to delist the Marapikarinya Yintha as a site. In July 2013, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs introduced new guidelines for the correct definition of a sacred site in Section 5 of the Act, which declared that for a place to be a sacred site requires that it is devoted to a religious use rather than a place subject to mythological story, song or belief. Any reading of Section 5 over decades with the most minuscule of legal experience would see that just simply can't stand. And I note, as a point of comparison and of cheek, the government just released its draft heritage bill for community consultation, broader heritage issues, released just last week. Clause 32 of that heritage bill stipulates that one of those factors to be recognised as a site of cultural heritage significance is if the site has, and again I quote, any strong or special meaning it may have for any group or community because of social, cultural or spiritual associations. Setting aside the decision by the ACMC to delist the Marapikarinya Yintha, Justice Chaney's decision was strong and clear. This surreptitious attempt to change the definition and application of site was comprehensively rejected by the Supreme Court. How the leadership of the DAA's heritage team survive in their job is beyond me. Combined with this Supreme Court humiliation is the fact that the state government's amendment seeks to specifically give mining companies the right to have certain decisions reviewed by the State Administrative Tribunal, while specifically denying those rights to Aboriginal groups, and show the insidious nature of those amendments. Section 19 capital D of the proposed amendments give access to the State Administrative Tribunal only to those persons aggrieved by the decision to either cancel a declaration that there is no Aboriginal site on land, or the person who holds a permit to do an act on land on which there might be an Aboriginal site. These are decisions against the interests of Aboriginal people, and specifically, by the way the interests are defined, excluded access to the State Administrative Tribunal. And again, as another matter of cheek, I'll outline another stark difference embedded in the proposed amendments. There is no statutory requirement to advertise or let anyone know about any decision by the government to provide a permit to do an act on land, which there might be an Aboriginal site, or a declaration that there is no Aboriginal site on land. That is, decisions negative to the interests of Aboriginal people and groups. No statutory requirement even to let recognised native title holders over that land know. However, Section 19 of the Act is proposed to be amended so that if the Minister is of the view that an Aboriginal site is of outstanding importance, that it should be declared a protected area, then there is a statutory requirement to publish that declaration in the Gazette, to publish that declaration in a newspaper circulating in the area where the site is situated, and a statutory requirement to publish that in a newspaper catering mainly or exclusively for the interests of persons of Aboriginal descent. Decisions to allow the destruction of a site or to declare that there is no site on a particular land will not be so promoted. Aboriginal people protect their heritage and celebrate its importance. Often, this is the only asset of value in the lives of Aboriginal people. Its loss is mourned and its protection taken seriously. These amendments will only condemn Aboriginal people to a never-ending battle to protect heritage rather than turning their efforts to more productive endeavours. This is 2015. We should, as a community, celebrate this extraordinary heritage, not seek to surreptitiously undermine its existence through legal reinterpretation and blatant legislative change. What is clear is that the singular argument by the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs that heritage gets in the way of development simply doesn't stack up. Between 2008 and June of 2015, there were 788 Section 18 applications. That is, applications made for ministerial consent to excavate, destroy, damage, conceal or some way alter an Aboriginal heritage site. Of those 788 applications, one was rejected. One. From the mouths of babes to the oldest among us, our heritage is our inheritance and our story, and it will be fought for. In light of the failure to harness any significant community support whatsoever, in light of the disingenuous nature of the reasons for the amendments given by the Minister, and in light of the clear, deliberate ill intent of the government and department exposed by Justice Cheney, Mr Barnett and his Minister have only one way forward in this debate, and that is to withdraw the legislation in its entirety and revisit the consultation with Aboriginal people. I have a sense that our nation is on the cusp, despite that critique. I have a sense that our nation is on the cusp of another important historical wave shaping Indigenous and Australian nation-state relationship. We are now embarking on a substantial debate about finding the words to insert in Australia's Constitution to recognise Aboriginal people. The debate is not about whether Indigenous people are to be recognised in the Constitution or not. Over 3/4 of mainstream Australia support such a change. The debate is over the form that that recognition will take. Will it be minimalist and fundamentally symbolic, or will it be meaningful with both powerful symbolism and practical substance? By practical substance, I mean, will the rules governing national lawmaking prohibit the Australian Parliament having the power to pass legislation that discriminates negatively against Australia's First Peoples. There is no debate more significant to Australia's nation building than this. Conservatives arguing for minimalist symbolic change claim that the democratic institution of Parliament can safeguard modern standards of decency, respect and inclusion. A constitutional prohibition on racism would transfer too much power away from parliaments to the courts. It would be the thin edge of the wedge leading to a Bill of Rights, is the argument. I have studied constitutional law and I understand the constitutional advice by experts, both sides of the constitutional debate. But I certainly subscribe to the view that a constitutional prohibition on racism or discrimination is nowhere near a Bill of Rights. The thing that the Adam Goodes saga showed is that racism can be so easily stirred, and the consequences to the victims can be devastating. As Noel Pearson said in his celebrated eulogy to Gough Whitlam, only those who have known discrimination truly know its evil. The consequences of racism to our national fabric can be poisonous. If a constitutional prohibition against racism is good enough to define the national values of modern South Africa and Germany, then why not Australia? The overwhelming view of Indigenous people is that they want our national constitution to make sure that a future government and parliament does not pass discriminatory law against Indigenous people. Because Indigenous people know too well the damage governments can do to a vulnerable people whose culture has been held in contempt by the dominant society. My sense of history is that people underestimate the potential for substantial policy change that constitutional change will bring. The 1967 constitutional amendment was as minimal as one could imagine in allowing Indigenous people to be counted in the census and giving the Commonwealth Parliament the power to make special laws for Indigenous people, yet the impact was profound and beyond, I think, community imagination. To think that 5 years after Australians voted to end the exclusion of Aboriginal people from Commonwealth responsibility, Whitlam went to the people in 1972 to introduce land rights legislation was extraordinary. For Whitlam, it was urgent. 3 weeks after being elected, he appointed Woodward to head up the Royal Commission into Aboriginal land rights. And when the Northern Territory Aboriginal Land Rights Act was passed 4 years later by the Fraser government, it was supported, according to opinion polling then, by 80% of Australians. Such a scenario could not have been imagined 10 years earlier. We may well be at a similar point in history when Australians will not only accept substantial change, but demand it because they are exhausted by incremental failure. But the policy ideas will not come from government, they rarely do. It will come from Indigenous leaders, and just as the ideas that prompted Whitlam's 1972 vision came from Aboriginal Australia, so too will the momentum for change happen on Abbott or Shorten's watch or whoever is in government over the next few years. Australians are demanding, I think, a new and just relationship with Indigenous Australia. But they want a relationship that can be clearly defined in practical terms as well as symbolism. Australians, I think, are starting to get over the slogans of closing the gap, reconciliation, self-determination or recognition. It's time for them to feed into a substantive outcome. What will be the defining features of a new relationship? What will Australia look like if we move with comprehensive national effort to include Aboriginal people and Indigenous culture in a renewed Australian nation-building project? I am fully cognizant of the consequences of a defeat at a referendum. It will be dramatic if that occurred. However, I also recognise that this debate and vote will see off the issue of the place of Aboriginal people in our legal structure for decades, probably for a similar 50-year period since the 1967 referendum. If we cannot convince enough Australians of the poison of discrimination now, then it may be worth waiting until we can. It will certainly be a shorter period of time than the consequences of inadequate change now. Indigenous leaders are already proposing the building blocks for a new and inclusive nation. And this institution, Notre Dame, is playing an important role in that journey. 3 months ago, 40-odd Indigenous leaders from throughout Australia attended a 2-day roundtable on property rights convened by Mick Gooder and Tim Wilson from the Australian Human Rights Commission, I think here in this room at Notre Dame. The discussion identified 5 key areas of reform which could be the basis of a new relationship. The potential for communal-owned Indigenous land to be economically productive, compensation arrangements for Indigenous people whose title has been surrendered, improved governance, new systems of finance and building capacity, simply. These 5 areas represent a challenging reform agenda for Indigenous communities in our nation. Having identified them as priorities, it is critical that Indigenous people be supported to research and develop these ideas and then negotiate institutional and legislative change with Commonwealth and state governments. What should happen is a partnership of Indigenous Australia, Commonwealth and state governments, corporate Australia, research institutions and NGOs to bring about the change that we need to overcome the legacy of colonialism and create a new nation that is genuinely inclusive and respectful of Indigenous culture and people. We can no longer rely solely on the political process. Corporate Australia must take on some of this burden, and judging by the take-up of reconciliation action plans, I see a strong indication that they are willing to do so. The nervousness, the awkwardness I referred to earlier in this speech means that we are more comfortable sometimes, more willing sometimes to accept the spend of billions of dollars on public money in the generic area of Aboriginal affairs rather than make the more substantial decision of cultural acceptance, celebration and empowerment. When I watched Adam Goodes celebrate his Aboriginal heritage with pride and authority, it seems it was this authority, this pride, this cultural aggression that caused the most offence to parts of non-Aboriginal Australia. This is the limited paradigm to which I refer when I talk about the Aboriginal cultural reality. Government is a reactive, ad hoc organisation. In Western Australia, Aboriginal people are still vulnerable to the financial priorities of the government of the day, regardless of its persuasion. We need to unshackle this codependence, pass the risk held stubbornly by government onto Aboriginal people to take. We must enable Aboriginal people to become serious people, confident in the sovereignty enjoyed by all other Australians. I look to the Kimberley as the place in which this grand experiment can start. This is what is being acknowledged by Conservatives and Progressives alike. Whilst many can't see it yet, there is a common language being spoken, and it is the future success of Aboriginal culture or Aboriginal people as a serious people which is at stake. Thank you.
I'm just going to make a few key statements that Ben has made that I was incredibly impressed by, and then I'm going to ask people if you would like to ask a question. So Ben said the answer is education. He set history as a context and spoke about unshackling Australia from its colonial past. And he said most Australians want to embrace this goal, but the process is awkward. He talked about a limited political paradigm, stating that self-determination in Australia is still the goal. And he talked about a discussion around how we as Australians view ourselves and imagining a new Aboriginal Australia. In fact, there is this one comment that was in his abstract that I think crystallises all of that, and that is, we stand at an opportune time for this nation to embrace the reality that Aboriginal cultural heritage is fundamental to the identity of all Australians. So, thank you, Ben. And are there questions?
I've got a question. It's just in relation to education. And I'm just wondering, do you believe that enough is being done, kids being taught enough in school in relation to, as we mentioned, the history of the First Peoples of this country? And I'm talking about on a national level as well as in Western Australia.
Look, it is almost a perpetual discussion, that issue of what is being taught. Whether it's enough, everybody in this room will have a different view, but it's certainly a lot more now than when I went through school not that long ago. And I learnt a lot about Germany, and I learnt a lot about Russia and the revolutions, and that was fantastic. But we didn't have any component of Australian history, not that long ago, so I'm young. But when I look at the program of schools now, there's a lot more Aboriginal history, a lot more Australian history being taught. So yes, there has been a big shift, I think, in a short space of time. Whether it's enough, I guess, I may have a different view to you, but I think now, looking at the public debates that you have, when I go to schools and speak to schools, as every MP does, there is much greater awareness from those students from year 6, 7 and up around the history of Aboriginal people in Western Australia. Josie no doubt gets the questions as I do around your family and my father and his experiences. So there is certainly a much greater awareness, and I think that is feeding through into all sorts of other areas of how governments interact with younger people, just simply because they've had a different educational experience. But I do want to make one point. I'm not yet convinced that what we do in education, it's about 30% of the state budget from memory. It's significant. We spend a lot. I don't necessarily mean we need to spend more, but I think we can spend it more effectively. I've been to schools where the principal's engaged and you get incredible outcomes that then drop away when the principal leaves. That happens in my own electorate in inner city Perth or communities that I'm familiar with. But it's in every case when there is one child that finishes school at some of these schools, there's only ever been one child that's gone through. The outcomes for those kids dramatically improve. And every statistic I've seen that link education, whether it's, as I said, job opportunities or health, the more education you've had, the better outcomes. So it's